Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Inside Florida Politics Podcast, powered by the USA Today Florida Network.
Well, President Donald Trump sounds 2026 campaign themes in a speech in Miami. Legislation that establishes fetal personhood passes its first hurdle in the Florida Senate. And does Governor Ron DeSantis' crusade to eliminate property taxes have the overtones perhaps of a power grab? I'm Antonio Fins, your host, and these are the topics I will be discussing on this episode with my USA Today Florida Network colleagues, Ana Goni-Lessan and John Kennedy, who looks like he's kind of in a Rockwellian scene this week. Well, the November 4th elections delivered a rebuke of sorts to President Trump's first 9 months in office. The outcomes that stung the president and Republicans the most were in Virginia and New Jersey's gubernatorial races. Why? Well, these are states that Trump ran really strong in last year, even though he didn't win. But he still had really closed the gap on that presidential election with, at the time, Vice President Kamala Harris. Those two states have been held up as places the GOP looked to realign voters in Democratic strongholds with Republican candidates, especially Latinos and working class whites in future elections. But Tuesday's returns showed those voters this time swung back to the rival Democrats. John, the 2026 midterm elections are around the corner. Any implications for deep red Florida in this week's outcomes?
Well, there is. While Florida didn't have any statewide races that we can really reflect on, you'd assume that a lot of the same frustrations motivating Hispanic voters and working class voters is also seen here. And that caused them to abandon Republicans in a number of contests across the nation. We talked a lot 2 years ago about how Trump flipped Miami-Dade to Republican and was making inroads with younger voters and even among black men. But Trump's heavy-handed immigration policies and failure to really significantly make people feel better off economically, well, you've got to wonder how he's doing now with some of those same cohorts here in Florida. And of course, Trump wasn't on the ballot this week, nor will he be during next year's midterms. So that seemed to be some kind of factor too. The voters who are there only because they are captivated by the showmanship and the bluster of Trump and maybe only vaguely aware of the policies, they evidently stayed home. Will that hurt in Florida next year? Well, we're going to have a governor's race as a motivator for Republicans. And then there's the overwhelming advantage in voter registration that Republicans have right now, an almost 1.4 million voter edge over Democrats. That kind of advantage can kind of likely paper over a lot of shortcomings in turnout and unpopular policies on the Republican side.
Well, speaking of unpopular policies, it's hard not to talk about the government shutdown. And in fact, the president himself admitted, or at least said the quiet part out loud in a social media post on his Truth Social platform, in which he said the GOP was getting blamed for the shutdown. And that's one of the reasons why they were hampered and the Democrats did so well in these races on Tuesday. The shutdown is now a record 37 days and counting. We don't have a huge number of federal workers in the state. Some of the really key federal facilities like the veterans hospitals are still open. So the impact is not, for example, like it is in Northern Virginia and some other states. But nonetheless, we have the situation where the food assistance payments are being delayed. There is a significant portion of people in Florida that depend on SNAP, the program. We do also know that Florida leads the country, as we've talked about in Obamacare enrollment, and the tax credits to make that program more affordable are at the core of the debate between Republicans and Democrats that have led to this shutdown. Is there vulnerability here in the shutdown? I think the other issue too here in Florida is airports. We're getting into the tourist season, the peak season for travel, the holidays. We're starting to hear about delays at airports. So if in fact people are more apt to blame Republicans and Democrats, could there be vulnerability here going forward as well?
Yeah, right now it seems to be, which team do voters believe is responsible for the shutdown? The shutdown is amplifying, though, I think, all the failures of those in charge. And right now, that's Republicans. So a majority of voters, polls showed, are putting the responsibility on Republicans for getting the government and the nation going again. In Florida, we've heard Democratic candidate David Jolly speak about how Florida Republicans are responsible for the state's high cost of homeowners insurance and a general affordability crisis that is really a burden on everyone in the state. Jolly, of course, is running for governor. He just is getting a primary opponent in Orange County Mayor Jerry Demings, who's jumping in the race. But so far, the theme has been, and I think you'll probably hear Demings echo some of this too, that there's a lack of interest among Republican leadership in Florida to do anything about it. Will that resonate in a campaign? Jolly has an uphill struggle, and now he's got a rival in Demings. But I think this affordability crisis is going to be the theme here and nationwide for Democratic candidates going forward. Republicans used a similar kitchen table strategy last year in defeating Democrats and regaining the White House and both chambers of Congress. Now it seems to be blowing up on Republicans because they haven't fixed the thing that they campaigned on.
Yeah, it's interesting because I covered President Trump's speech in Miami yesterday to the America Business Forum, and he really gave a good hint at what these 2026 campaign speeches from him are going to be about. One key theme is communism. And he latched on to the New York mayor, the Social Democrat, Zoran Mamdani, and calling him a communist, and said that 2026 voters will face a choice between common sense and communism. And he did also, take a victory lap of sorts, particularly, stock markets, that have been at records. He did settle the Gaza conflict, although that's a very flinty truce. He's talked a lot about these commitments, not actual delivery, but commitments and pledges for, upwards of $20 trillion in foreign investment in the U.S. that he says is going to lead to an explosion of well-paying jobs and so forth. The question is, at the other end, he also rehashed a lot of 2024 presidential campaign themes. He mused about transgender weightlifters, sleepy Joe Biden, the terrible mess that he left behind and whatnot. But I like you're right, John. I think the question will be a year from now, whether Americans in the middle and lower economic stratas of the economy, how good do they feel about their finances when it's time to cast those midterm votes? But Anna, let's flip this to you. 2026 is not just a midterm election year. It will also be Governor Ron DeSantis' last session as the state's chief executive. And right now in the Florida Senate, there's an issue that he has pushed hard, banning abortions and reproductive rights. And that has surged to the forefront again. That would be in the Florida Senate, and that would be the civil liability for the wrongful death of an unborn child, or Senate Bill 164. You've written about the measure, and you noted that it would give parents the ability to sue for damages for the wrongful death of an unborn child. But it also defines unborn child as, quote unquote, a member of the species Homo sapiens at any stage of development who is carried in the womb. So, Anna, what's up there? Is this a way to get justice, or is this a back alley way of, again, restricting reproductive health care?
Well, it depends on who you ask, right, Antonio? So, this is the third year that Aaron Grawl has tried to file this bill that critics are calling a fetal personhood bill. In Florida, you can seek civil, basically civil liability. You can seek funds if your unborn child has died. But this is different. This goes all the way back to at any point in the gestation of the member of the species of Homo sapiens, right? So it's a little this has been something that she's wanted to do probably since she's been in the Senate. This is the third year, right? She's passed other bills. She was the sponsor for the 6-week abortion ban. She's very passionate in this issue. And so we'll see. This year again, the bill has evolved, I guess, over the past 3 years. They've added more things. So, for example, in the first iteration of the bill, it did not have a protection for the mother. For example, you cannot sue the mother of the fetus for wrongful death. So that's been stuck in the bill. This year, there's a carve out for IVF, which was an issue last year and an issue in the year before, because IVF can be a controversial issue among evangelicals because of the fact that you are using human embryos, right, to implant inside the body. I don't know if you guys remember this, but I think it was 2022, 2023, Alabama also had this issue where they voted that, embryos had human rights. And then suddenly IVF clinics shut down. People started getting really nervous about their embryos. Parents were worried about what was going to happen. And so then the legislature had to come back and undo that decision by the Alabama Supreme Court. So these are things that have made their way into the bill over the past 3 years. And it only narrowly passed 5-4 on Tuesday. So it's not that it doesn't have as much support as you think it would in DeSantis's Florida, right? So we're gonna see. We're gonna see how it goes through committee. It has died in Senate rules the past 2 years. A version of this bill has passed through the House, but has not made it through the Senate. So we'll see. We'll see how 2026 goes.
Now, a question about the mechanics of the legislature. So a version of it has passed the House. Is that still valid, or does it need to pass the House again to reflect what they got here?
It needs to pass through the Senate, and then they need to agree on the iteration of the bill, and then they both need to pass that version of the bill to then send it to the governor's office, right?
And any sense of what DeSantis has said about this type of legislation in the past?
He's been a very pro or anti-abortion governor, right? He definitely touts Florida as being, a state that values life. That's the way that Senator Aaron Grahl has put it. That's the way that Ron DeSantis has put it. However, at the same time, he's also signed a really long list of death warrants this year. So just putting that out there. We'll see what happens next year.
All right. Hey, John, speaking of the governor, he also wants to take one final shot at property taxes. It sounds like a great deal for property owners, getting rid of the real estate tax, but it would also cut the amount of money that cities get for, libraries, cultural programs, and other initiatives. DeSantis has talked about steering state money to replace lost revenue in 29. You've reported on these 29 fiscally constrained counties that are most of these small and rural ones, but the move would then, I guess, make these counties way more dependent on Tallahassee for money each year, and would give, I guess, the GOP-controlled legislature direct authority over what policies those municipalities enact. Is this, good government, or an effort to give Tallahassee even more control over purse strings and public policy, as we know that they have been taking aim at a lot of the type of, work that a lot of these municipalities do, like, for example, even to the point of, painting crosswalks, they want control over. So is it about control of purse strings, or is it about more domination of public policy?
Yeah, there really is a question here of, when is cutting property taxes not just about cutting property taxes? The answer might be it's when, it's also about DeSantis and ruling Republicans in Tallahassee gaining more control over cities and counties. And yet a lot of those counties and cities lean Democratic. So the Republicans in Tallahassee are not very fond of a lot of the policies that they've seen through the years. DeSantis wants to ask voters to erase property taxes, at least on homesteaded property primary residence. That's taking away a leading source of revenue for most local governments. And the legislature will be taking up a range of ideas in January when they convene for the 2026 session. And a goal seems to be to come up with a few proposed ballot initiatives for voters to consider next November. DeSantis hasn't said precisely what he wants to do, but his tax cutting goal would certainly change the state, and maybe not for the better. The critics are saying higher home prices, fewer city and county services, and a state government gaining enhanced authority over the purse strings and the policies then of Florida's hometowns. That's a likely product, according to some of the analysts that I've spoken to. Not the least of the items lost, or at least changed, is the ability of local governments to have the funds to give residents, really what they want to have, even in places that historically have been willing to pay more for services that improve the quality of life for their residents. Property taxes are really the fuel for local governments, and by far the biggest services is public safety. But a portion of these revenues also finance parks, libraries, and social programs that really have come under fire this year. And when there's, the idea of a state gaining more control over the dollars, then they can have more control over the policy and where those dollars get directed. So that's all part of this mix right now. And, voters are going to have to decide. We're just past the NFL trading deadline, and this has a little bit of a parallel in that when voters go to the ballot next year, they're going to have to decide, if they're going to gain something by trading a decline in property taxes, which they probably welcome. What are they going to be giving up in exchange? So, it's a little bit of a NFL trading deadline kind of issue as well. So we've all been anxious over that, and that's going to be something that the legislature is going to be wrestling with, throughout this upcoming session.
Well, it's kind of interesting because I guess one of the reasons that you can't blame people for reading an overtone of a power grab here is simply because, quite frankly, this governor and the legislature, they have been really involved in local government affairs. There's that law that they pass that basically no local government can pass a law that that conflicts in any way with a state law. And then this year we talked a lot about the 287G agreements, in which basically the state has deputized local law enforcement to carry out this really what is a federal policy of immigration enforcement and cracking down and arresting and detaining people. So Republicans have always talked about, the division of power between the federalist system, federal government, state and local, states' rights and so forth. And I guess their view of states' rights these days is way more expanded than it was some years ago.
And we've seen the chief financial officer, Blaise Ngolia. He's been going around the state in these Doge-style reviews of city and county government, and he's been attacking them for overspending, as he describes it, based on kind of a mathematical formula that he's worked out related to population growth and how revenue has been growing. And in the end, what he finds as excess spending, so far, a lot of his attacks have focused primarily on city and county spending on diversity programs, LGBTQ pride events, Planned Parenthood support, and other items which really appeal to that Republican voting base that's easily antagonized by the cultural flashpoints. So will cutting taxes be a way for Republicans to eliminate such local spending that they don't like? DeSantis and the legislature in recent years, as you pointed out, they have enacted a scores of so-called preemption bills that limit local government's ability to tax, spend, or even ban single-use plastics or promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. So all this is part of that property tax debate right now, even though it's a little bit behind the scenes. But if you start taking money away from government, that's going to limit what government can spend money on.
Well, it's going to be interesting. As you say, it's ultimately, it'll be up to the voters next year, because this is something that would have to be a constitutional amendment, and they would have a right, and it had to get that 60% threshold. So a simple majority wouldn't be good enough. So anyway, that's all we got for this week. Again, I want to thank our production guru, Rob Landers, and all our colleagues in the USA Today Florida network, whose work and reporting and editing and all the work that they do really does inform the podcast and allow us to really come up with topics that are as wide-ranging as they are from week to week. Until next time, See you soon.